This is Helen Lovejoy. She is the self-described gossipy wife of the minister, Timothy Lovejoy. When she is not casting judgment on others or being terrible in general to Marge, she is expressing outrage over the state of Springfield. In particular, she cares deeply about the children. Helen is a devout Christian and is generally supportive of her husband's work. Their marriage has, however, lost its sizzle over time, and Helen has tried various surprising and freaky things to spice things up. But you didn't hear that from me. This is the history of Helen Lovejoy. Helen Lovejoy is the worst. Nobody likes her. She is one of the most consistently antagonistic characters on the show, written in a way where you're supposed to be supremely annoyed by her antics. But I'd imagine there are some fans of Helen out there as a character, just because she's so over-the-top judgmental and passive-aggressive towards people. And I suppose you gotta have someone on the show ready to spill the tea at a moment's notice. In addition, she's kind of a mysterious character. She's good at spreading rumors, but doesn't really talk about herself that much. So what is going on with Helen Lovejoy? Does she really have her life together? Let's take a look. Helen's very first speaking role was in Season 1's Life on the Fast Lane, where she catches Marge having brunch with Jacques. It's a pretty brief appearance, but gets straight to the point on her shtick. She's gossipy, she's the minister's wife, she makes Marge uncomfortable, we wish someone would run her over. Check. Season 2 brought in a couple major new components for her character. First, her responsibility in handing over the phone to her husband when Ned Flanders calls. This is a hilariously consistent aspect to these jokes. Helen always seems to set up the conversation with a very knowingly announcement. Secondly, Season 2 introduces her activism and outrage over the state of the world. She readily joins SNA with Maud Flanders and leads the charge against Michelangelo's David. She describes male genitalia as practical but evil, establishing her general prudishness and shock toward anything that could be considered sexual in nature. This obviously makes a ton of sense why they chose Helen Lovejoy for this role. There are definitely Christians who preach abstinence only and have similar reactions to these situations. Helen was somewhat of a slow starter on the series, being used very sparingly in the first 6 seasons. She'd mostly pop up to express her judgment on whatever the plot is, and then go away. She'll complain about the Simpsons marketing, theorize that Flanders is jealous of Homer, declare the defendant obviously guilty, comment that their elephant is bad-tempered. She plays a slightly larger role in Marge in Chains in Season 4, testifying in the shoplifting trial and suggesting that Marge drinks. This is the closest to an episodic character arc Helen actually gets. In the end, she actually expresses regret. Regret? From Helen Lovejoy? Inconceivable! Her other prominent role is in Bart's girlfriend. She isn't paired up with Bart for many scenes together in the series, but they are surprisingly good comedic foils. This appearance sorta has it all. Her leading questions, her dismissiveness, her shrieking disgust. Make it stop! Make it stop! Now, the early seasons were nice and all, but I would argue that Helen Lovejoy's best era on the show were the Oakley and Weinstein years, Seasons 7 and 8. There is one pretty iconic reason why. Season 7 brought us Much Ado About Nothing, which spawned the immortal line, "Will somebody please think of the children?" Say what you want about Helen Lovejoy's lack of relevance on The Simpsons, but that's a pretty huge contribution to pop culture, even if she didn't technically invent the tactic. Not many Simpsons characters have their own law named after them. She says a variation on the phrase 3 separate times in the episode, escalating the shrillness in each instance. Interestingly, they didn't really run with this as a long-running catchphrase for her. She says it again in the Prohibition episode, and in Season 9, Moe steals her line. But other than that, they mostly leave it alone. Season 8 was really good to Helen too, probably her most prolific year. It gave her the maison derrière to protest against, a chance to accuse Lisa of being on drugs, and a rumor that Skinner and Krabappel were doing it! Season 8 provided a lot of scandal for her to comment on. In addition, they really ramped up the antagonistic relationship between she and Marge. She delivers a delightfully catty greeting to Marge in the Chili Pepper episode, absolutely savoring every moment of judgment. Even Reverend Lovejoy finds it too indulgent, telling her to call off the dogs. We also have the pretzel episode, where Helen leads the charge in kicking Marge out of the Investorettes. You could argue that all the ladies were getting tired of Marge's routine, but Helen seems to be the leader of the group. She is the one who immediately declares Marge as popular as Rugburn and calls a vote to kick her out. We don't really get to see Marge have many female friends and acquaintances in the early years. It was just Ruth Powers and that country club. This episode sort of reinforces Marge and Helen's relationship as frenemies, a dynamic we will see a ton in the later seasons. I think my favorite character moment for Helen Lovejoy is in the Listen Lady episode, where Reverend Lovejoy gets super depressed and she reluctantly calls Marge to ask for advice to help him. Helen's an extremely proud person, and we just talked about how judgmental she is toward Marge. The fact that she's able to swallow her pride, push through the awkwardness, and ask for Marge for help for her husband, well, that's a really nice moment. Spoiler warning, this video isn't going to be super complimentary of her in general, but you gotta give her credit right here. So it's the end of Season 8, and Helen Lovejoy is flying high. What next? Well, she practically falls off the face of the earth, a veritable Helen Lovejoy dark age until Season 14 or 15. She has an extremely strange history on the show, due to the situation with her voice actor. Around Season 10, Maggie Roswell has a pay dispute with Fox over her travel expenses, and Fox, ever the cheapskates, opts to let her go. Maggie Roswell also voices characters like Miss Hoover, Luann Van Houten, and Maud Flanders. This ultimately led to the writers killing off Maud in Season 11. They brought in a different voice actor for Maud and Helen Lovejoy on a few occasions, but she couldn't replicate the original performance. The Helen impression is particularly bad. It's like way too deep for her character. Although to be fair, Helen's voice does deepen noticeably over the years. But this one in Tennis the Menace was just really weird to listen to. Eventually, Roswell was able to reach an agreement to return to the show. But at that point, they had already killed off Maud Flanders. So what do? As a result, Helen Lovejoy had a sort of renaissance in the later years of the show. She never became like a major secondary character or anything, but from around Season 18 and on, the show suddenly seemed more interested in the Lovejoys. They started popping up in more episodes again as a couple. When something like Mo Letter Blues is being produced, Helen Lovejoy is selected as one of the candidates Mo might run away with. Turns out in that example, their marriage wasn't on the rocks, at least not yet, and she was planning a trip instead. The most controversial Helen Lovejoy moment happened in Season 20's Wedding for Disaster. The parson comes by to tell Reverend Lovejoy about a certification issue, and he says he remembers when Helen was Helen Schwartzbaum. He even remembers when she was Harold Schwartzbaum. There's a lot to unpack here. The last name Schwartzbaum is intended to imply Helen may have come from a Jewish background. The Harold part of it is just really confusing, to be honest. Tim didn't know about this, and they did have a daughter together. Is the implication that Helen is a trans woman? Is Jessica adopted? Or did she identify as male at some point in her life? Maybe Helen is gender fluid. It probably wasn't when she was 10 years old, since she was with Marge at Camp Landaman. Of course, it might just be that the parson was just messing with Reverend Lovejoy. Who knows? Based on his shocked reaction, this line is seemingly meant to make fun of religious people, who are so very terrified about gender. The writers never really followed up on this in later episodes, so it's treated more as an unspoken aspect of her characterization. This moment tends to be the exception to the rule. Most of Helen's modern appearances fall into her typical routine. Gossiping about Cletus and Brandine, protesting the MMA, peer pressuring Marge into buying an expensive handbag. The frenemy aspect is ratcheted up much higher in this era. We get Season 29's Whistler's Father, where she insults Marge's decorating style, which starts up this whole B-plot about Marge trying to prove her wrong, eventually leading to Marge decorating Fat Tony's bordello by accident. However, here's where the show starts letting Marge bite back, and put Helen in her place. Geez, Marge, it only took you like 18 seasons to stand up to her. In 24 minutes, Marge tackles her at the grocery store over a box of raisins. In the very next episode, aired that same night, Marge is rushing home, Helen is getting in the way to share some gossip, and Marge just shoves her out of the way. In Treehouse of Horror 20, Helen becomes a muncher and attacks the car. Marge shoots her with the shotgun. Also, according to this episode, Helen is Lisa's godmother. Not sure if that counts canonically, though. Later on in season 28, Marge actually slaps Helen across the face after she criticizes her husband. Then in season 30, we get a less violent example where Marge gives Helen a taste of her own passive-aggressive medicine. She tauntingly asks Helen why she's so bitter. Is it because her husband would rather play with his trains than with her? Wrecked. Unfortunately, that's the perfect segue for where we need to go next. Now we gotta talk about the Lovejoy's sex life. I can't believe we're going here. This is kind of insane, this has to be a talking point. But it's become this recurring thing with them in the later years. In season 18, they get really competitive about rooting for Jessica in soccer to try to, quote, save their troubled marriage. Then, later that same season, there is a B-plot about Homer selling mattresses or something. And the Lovejoys come to him, embarrassingly describing that they're having sex problems and want to buy a new mattress. When the mattress they buy doesn't fix their problem, they discover Homer and Marge's gets them going. So they end up trading with them instead of getting a refund. The episode ends with Homer and Marge having sex in the Lovejoys' house on their old mattress, and the two couples cutting the mattress in half, diagonally for some reason. We also learn Tim and Helen's lovemaking routine involves a Michael Bolton CD and edible vestments. Oh, but we're not done yet. Not even close. In season 24, Homer runs into Helen Lovejoy at a sex shop, who pretends she doesn't know where she is. Then Reverend Lovejoy appears in S&M gear, asking her annoyedly if this outfit is dominating enough for her. Initially kind of surprised that Helen would want to be the submissive here, but maybe that makes sense given her control freak personality. I don't want to speculate on this further. Finally, we have the episode Sky Police in season 26, where members of the church start a card counting scheme to raise money for repairs. Yes, this is based on a real thing that happened. But anyway, at one point, they all have to dress up in disguises to play, and the Lovejoys are drawn to this rocker goth sort of look. When Marge stops by their house the next morning, Tim is still wearing his outfit. He says they found the outfit liberating. Helen then calls out and asks if there's a woman at the door, and if so, wants to have a three-way. Yeah, the Lovejoys clearly have a lot of creative interests. I'm not kink-shaming them or anything, it actually kinda makes me like them more that they could let loose a little. This is clearly a commentary on the buttoned-up Christian archetype and how they often frown upon anything impure from a sexual standpoint. Helen Lovejoy makes these statements all the time. Ned and Maude wouldn't have worked for this kind of joke in the early years. It makes sense that they went with the Lovejoys for this kind of dynamic. Adds an extra layer of hypocrisy to Helen's character, you know? Won't somebody please think of the children? Helen Lovejoy is a bit like Nelson in some ways, like what the adult version of schoolyard bullies would look like. When you grow up, you don't really deal with wedgies and random assault and battery that often. It's the Helen Lovejoys of the world who make life miserable for people. Much like with Nelson, that's why I really like when they poke at Helen's facade, showing off some of her vices. Now, unlike Nelson, who comes off as more childish and vulnerable, it sort of reinforces Helen's status as the biggest hypocrite of the show. But honestly, that's what I want out of her. I want her to consistently throw stones from her glass house. What the later seasons get right is showing off that glass house, that Helen has her own scandalous interests. That being said, I do think they could have a little more fun with Helen Lovejoy and not just have her be a big negative presence most of the time. Like, Mr. Burns is also a villain, but he still gets a lot of light and silly jokes. I think the early years understood how over-the-top dramatic Helen is, and had a lot of fun with that. Her appearances weren't just about being mean to Marge, they were written in a way that reminded us of why gossip can be fun. The joke shouldn't just be that Helen is mean. And I wouldn't mind seeing Marge turning the tables on Helen more often. And I don't think it would be a great idea to keep having Marge smack her around and stuff in the future. We obviously don't need that. But I probably would like Helen a lot more if she just took an L every once in a while. Let me know in the comments what you think of how Helen Lovejoy has been portrayed on the show, and your favorite moments with her. She is such an antagonistic presence on the show. I'd be interested if you like that she fills that role, or if they should keep finding new things to do with her. Also, as per usual, please nominate the next character to be covered for Simpsons Histories. With the very sad passing of Russi Taylor recently, maybe Martin Prince should be next. Although it might be worth seeing what they're going to do with the character first, whether they're going to retire him or not. Not sure what the best timing should be for him. Maybe we should save Martin for later and pick somebody else for now. Let me know what you think. As always, thanks for watching.